RWBY is a show about four girls attending a school to fight monsters, but sinister forces lurk in the background. They have an evil plot that could turn the whole world into ruin. Can RWBY, Weiss, Blake, Yang, and their closest friends find a way to stop the forces of pure evil and save the world? Hi there. If you don't know what RWBY is and you clicked on this video without knowing anything about the show, this is the best synopsis for the plot I could give you, in case you were curious about consuming one of RWBY's supplemental pieces of material, the DC Comics. As a huge fan of the show, I was honestly very surprised to see DC announce their partnership with Rooster Teeth to make a comic centered around the show RWBY. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you up front. If you don't know anything about the show, then this comic probably isn't for you. It's such a shame, because I thought this comic could have worked really well as a shortcut to help get people into the show without having to sit through the first couple of seasons, but unfortunately it doesn't really work that way. For perspective, the events of these comics take place between the 4th and 5th seasons. It's jumping over 3 whole years worth of story and character development, and it does very little to actually establish any of it. If you go in blind, there are chapters that'll help establish important world-building elements, but when it comes to the story or characters, you're mostly looking at crumbs here and there. So instead, you might be thinking these comics are for the old school fans for the show. The ones who have sat through all the seasons and know the characters and the lore. Well, kind of. Having to stop everything to explain the world-building mechanics can really be a detriment to the flow of certain stories. So who is this series for? Are these comics even any good? Well, let's dive into the comics themselves to find out. So I got the full series, and the first 6 pages all feature different art styles. This isn't exactly bad or unheard of, it's just a little eyebrow-raising to see how drastically different the girls look between them all, especially Blake. No one ever seems to draw Blake's bangs the same way as each other. Oh, if you're one of those people who don't know anything about RWBY and you're still sticking around for my review, hi again. If you think any of these pictures of Team RWBY look cool and makes you think the show might be something you want to check out, then I highly suggest you do. I bet you would enjoy it. Anyways, let's start the comic proper. So we start with a prologue, the elegy, which shows us a pretty big element of this comic. The fact that we're going to be regularly jumping back and forth between events from the past and events from the present. This never got confusing to me while reading. After all, the large letters that say then and now make it clear enough that we weren't in the same space and time anymore. But it also becomes very apparent we've changed time frames based on what the characters look like. When we see our heroes as little kids, it's pretty obvious, but they'll also be wearing different clothes in their flashbacks compared to the present. So we start with our plucky protagonist, Ruby Rose, transitioning from reading a book about a cool monster hunter to her as a teenager, living out that story herself. Ruby explains the fact that their world is full of evil monsters called the Grimm, and she and her sister are following in their parents' footsteps to attend the school that trains them to fight these monsters, and earn the title of Huntress. What's happening with Ruby here? Maybe I'm crazy, but I feel like her head is a little too big? Well anyways, Ruby's mother, Summer, unfortunately dies on a mission, but Ruby, alongside her big sister Yang, fight their hardest to become huntresses, and What is that? What is happening to your neck? I don't get it. Everyone else looks fine. Most of this chapter looks really good. Hell, that picture of the girls and their father in front of Summers' grave is downright beautiful. What is this? It's really not a good look to start your comic with 2 weird-looking panels within the first 9 pages. This chapter basically sets up the basics of the world and the characters. Yang is a sexy badass and is actually Ruby's half-sister. They have the same dad, different mothers. Blake is beautiful, but don't let her beauty fool you. She's got the street smarts and the wit to take care of herself when the world turned its back on her. Weiss comes from a rich family and is very strict, not only on herself, but on everyone around her. And through her narration, we get some insight on Ruby too. She's fun, optimistic, and the leader of their titular team, RWBY. Red, white, black, and yellow. The rest of the chapter gives us a quick rundown of the girls' abilities and hints at the bigger plot behind the scenes, ending with showing us how our 4 girls have actually been separated after their school was attacked and destroyed by evil forces. It doesn't really do the first 3 seasons of the show justice, but it works for what the comics need. If you go through this first chapter and feel overwhelmed and lost, then maybe this comic wouldn't work very well for you. However, I can say that it doesn't rely too much on knowing the backstory or lore of the world. These comics are really a character piece, diving into the insights and emotions of our four main girls. If that sounds like fun for you, then I highly suggest reading the comics yourselves before continuing with this review. I'll be going into full spoilers with the rest of this review, and if you want to see the stories unfold on your own, then here's your final warning. If you're sticking around, then let's keep going. The first real chapter, titled Stories, gives us a cute story about Ruby and Yang as little kids, and I love this. I always wanted to see more of the sisters being, well, sisters with each other, and having them be younger is a really cute way to put them in that sisterly dynamic. This comic is also kind of heartbreaking, because it starts with Ruby trying to cope with Summer's death. There are a lot of moms, and Summer Rose is mine. Or, was, I guess. No, still is mine. This is really telling on how Ruby handles her mom's death. Kids faced with the death of an important person in their life see death in vastly different ways. And seeing Ruby take on a much more optimistic approach to it really highlights how she's carried this mindset into her teenage years. She's not a goofy, fun-loving girl for no reason. She does it because that's what helped her cope with the world around her. It's kind of amazing seeing how good this chapter is. Especially since we see Ruby trying to get the adults to talk to her about Summer, but no one wants to actually talk to her. She guesses it's because they're too sad to discuss Summer after her passing, but it's still so impressive to me. Ruby, even as a child, is determined to learn more about her mom, and she gets most of the best stories from Yang, though Yang has the tendency to over-exaggerate Summer's greatness, which also tells us a lot about Yang herself. While Ruby is coping with Summer's death very rationally, Yang is sort of putting Summer up on a pedestal. It makes sense she wouldn't want to disappoint Ruby when it comes to their late mother, but at the same time, she's essentially selling herself on Summer's stories too. Unfortunately, a shitty raven starts telling Ruby awful things about Summer, and it upsets Ruby, who accuses the bird of being a Grimm. If this seems weird and out of left field, don't worry, it's not. It makes sense. This raven is in the show too, and it's a terrible bitch. While the girls get upset, their best Uncle Crow comes to visit. Crow tells the girls the truth about Summer. She was a great person. Not some top-tier, super amazing, flawless hero like how Yang was saying. Not some weakling like how the raven was saying. The truth. She was good. She did what she could. She was flawed and she made mistakes, but her heart was what pushed her forward. To keep working no matter what. To do the right thing no matter how hard it might be. That's what inspired Ruby to keep fighting, and to keep moving forward. Honestly, compared to the prologue, this first chapter is way better. No heavy-handed exposition, no janky art, it's just great. We then go into our next chapter. This one focuses on Yang now. She's recently lost her arm during the attack on the school that separated the girls, and she's having a hard time coping with this new, disabled life of hers. These panels of Yang thinking about the various daily uses she has two hands for is subtle, yet very powerful. Yeah, how do you braid your little sister's hair with only one hand? You can't. Seeing that his daughter is rightfully frustrated with her situation, Ty, her father, tells her she needs to go help out an elderly neighbor with some of her chores. There's an old hollow tree that needs uprooting, a field that needs fertilizing, and her stables need to be cleaned. So through these comics, Yang regularly uses the exclamation of, "Oh, grapes!" She never uses this in the show, and I really wish she would because I think it's adorable. Yang realizes the elderly neighbor is also a healer, and she wonders if she could help her with her lost arm, and that's why she wanted Yang to help her with these chores, especially since they seem near impossible in her current condition. However, Yang gets an idea and charges forward. Yang can take damage she receives, and it gives her a boost in power, so she purposefully scares a horse to kick her so she can take that damage, and give herself the strength it takes to kick down an old rotten trough. It both washes out the stables, while simultaneously fertilizes the field. Yang then uses an axe to cut down the hollow tree, and she splits it to make a new trough for the elderly woman. But when Yang excitedly asks the old woman if she's passed her test, she realizes that there never was one. She can't bring her arm back. She just honestly needed the help with the chores. Yang is upset, but the old neighbor tells her while she may not be able to bring her arm back, it's up to Yang to make sure she doesn't let it stop her. This is another really, really sweet chapter. The art style looks so amazing this time around too, with some really beautiful panels. And the message of this chapter is one I really wanted Yang to hear. Seeing her throw the book in frustration in the beginning of the chapter, to sitting herself down to read it even with one arm, is a nice way to wrap this whole chapter up. Next up, it's Blake's turn. We see her hanging out in a crummy little sailboat on her way back to Menagerie, looking fondly at a little orange bottle cap. This chapter mostly tells us about her past involvement with the White Fang, a group of Faunus radicals who at first tried to fight for Faunus equality, but after a few years have become closer to the likes of a terrorist organization. That's a lot to take in all at once, like the word Faunus, basically people with animal features, like Blake, who has cat ears. Honestly, other than that statement I just said, you don't really need to know more about the White Fang to follow the storyline with Blake. Though, for transparency's sake, it does get a little more complicated in the show, which is one of the reasons why I say these comics wouldn't be very good for someone who's trying to dive into the world of RWBY without knowing anything about the show first. Blake meets a somewhat scary-looking guy named Adam, though after she sees him crying and notices a large scar on his face, she starts to become interested in him, and I like the way she puts it. I was spellbound. So I feel like this needs some better explanation for this chapter. In Season 3, we find out Blake was in a partnership with Adam. Whether it ever became something romantic, we never confirm or deny. However, it does become very apparent that Blake at least had romantic feelings for him. However, we also find out that Adam has become an abusive piece of shit. This chapter of the comic really fills in the blanks when it comes to filling out their backstory. How Blake met him, how she fell in love with him, how he changed over the years, and ultimately how she realizes he never actually changed, he was always this ruthless, heartless man. She was just too wrapped up in loving him to really notice. Intoxication is just a fancy word for its own heart. Toxic. It's a pretty intense little chapter, and it's really rare we ever actually see Blake back when she was in the White Fang, or her time being with Adam. She tosses the bottle cap into the ocean, desperate to separate herself from her friends, so they can't get hurt around her anymore, convincing herself she's poison to those she cares about. It's so painful seeing Blake blaming herself for Adam's change in character, for Yang's dismemberment, for the pain in her life. The next chapter is titled, Look at Me, and I want you to strap in, boys and girls, because this one is fucking amazing. Weiss has been taken back to live with her mom and dad, trapped in the Schnee Manor. While stuck there, she thinks back to her time with her friends back at the academy. Specifically, how one little snot-nosed shit, Carden Winchester, kept on teasing her for being from a rich household, insisting she was only in the school because she had bought her way in. She does her best to prove otherwise, excelling in her classes. Just watch. Look at me. Look at me. Look at me now. Team RWBY participates in an obstacle course. Winner gets a rare book from the library. The only rule? Cross the finish line by any means necessary. And Weiss is determined to do just that and prove to Carden once and for all what she's made of. Weiss manages to beat Carden and win the whole thing, however not without a few tricks and traps here and there to trip up Carden along the way. Proud she was able to show up Carden, Weiss celebrates. Unfortunately, Blake confronts her on her underhanded tactics, telling Weiss she's disappointed in her for resorting to the kind of tricks someone like Carden would have used to win, and she would have been more proud of herself if she had actually won the course fair and square. I know I've been given a lot. I've had so much just handed to me by my family. But this one thing, my life as a huntress, is something I had to earn by myself, and I have. When people see me now, they don't see my father, his company, our money, our name. They think of my determination to be the best of all of us. And look at me. Blake, look at me. Look at me now. So we've seen each girl featured in a chapter themselves now. From here on out, I'm going to be a bit more brief with my reviews of the individual chapters. After all, if any of these chapters caught your interest, I'm still going to try to give you plenty of time to read them yourself. But let's keep going. The next one, The Egg, which is a weird name, comes back around to feature RWBY. I'm gonna be honest, this is one of the worst chapters. It just shows RWBY traveling with her other friends, Jean, Ren, and Nora, on their way to Mistral. On the surface, it's a little story about people not trusting them after what happened to their school. For context, the bad guys basically painted the Huntsman Academy students to be ruthless and something to be feared. The kids help fight off a threat despite the fact the citizens ran them off before. But really, all this chapter does is gives us a little background on the bigger plot. It's really a shame because they don't give us enough explanation to really, explain anything. It just comes across as very confusing, and I wish we could have spent more time with RWBY's headspace as a traveler, looked down on by others, rather than waste her chapter giving us half-assed backstory. And the backstory doesn't even pertain to the rest of the chapters in the comics. There's not even very good art here. Yeah, some panels are cool, but most of them feel rushed or slightly off. Like the shot with Penny's corpse in the fire. I get what they were going for, but it just looks like they're actually cooking Penny in the fire. It's boring and super skippable. Holy art style change, Batman! Yeah, I was pretty surprised to see the art change so dramatically here. It's not terrible, but in my opinion, it's not nearly as good as the first chapters. Anyways, this one is Magic Words. This story follows Yang back when she was still in school, where we see she's always going out of her way to try to help those around her. A cute character trait for sure, but unfortunately one that's literally never seen in the show? Sure, I could definitely believe Yang would go out of her way to help her friends, but we never even get a hint that it's something she would have a problem with. Anyways, she gets hung up trying to help Blake, trying to get her to open up more to those around her. We see this is where Blake got her soda cap from before. This chapter is fine, nothing super special. It's cute seeing Blake and Yang just hanging out, but it's really wordy. I'm never a fan whenever I see huge walls of texts filling up the majority of a panel. That, combined with the sort of wonky facial expressions here and there, and the out-of-character motivation for Yang, and I found this chapter to be pretty skippable too. The one that got away keeps the same artist from the last chapter as we bounce back over to Blake, landing back at her home, Menagerie. Surprise! She's got a new outfit, and she's on a yacht now, and she's got a hot blonde monkey boy following her around. Yeah, there's a lot here that never gets explained, specifically the monkey boy, Sun, and his friendship with Blake. But I suppose that doesn't really matter because most of this chapter is just Blake hanging out with her mom in bathing suits. Wow, a Bumblebee chapter followed up by a bikini chapter? Yeah, I wonder who the target audience was for this book, huh? Blake and her mom go fishing and her mom tells her about some old story about a princess. Really the important part is Blake confiding in her mom about her feelings, about how she feels like she's hurting the people around her. It's actually nice seeing Blake talking to her mother like this. It was actually completely absent from the show. Just like last time though, this chapter is really wordy, even more so actually. The books come out with 2 chapters each. These last 2 chapters come from book 3, and you could really skip the whole book and not miss much. Next up is The Hunter and the Hunted, bringing us back to Weiss, where we actually get to see her mother as well, Willow. Willow explains that she wants to go out and catch a new animal to add to her collection and enlists Weiss's help. When Weiss shows reservations, Willow tries to reason with her, explaining that she believes in her strength. She says Weiss reminds her of herself, and encourages her to show her everything she's learned at school. Oh, well, that's sweet. Just ignore that cup in her hand, I'm sure it's fine. They head out, and Weiss catches Willow a stag, upon Willow's insistence of, "Make me proud." Willow seems thrilled, and Weiss smiles, even though she was hesitant when it came to catching the animal. Unfortunately, later, Willow boasts about the new catch, and she claims she was the one who caught it. Willow is an alcoholic, abusive piece of shit. When we meet Willow in the show, she's gotten to a point where she's regretful of how she's raised her children, and she never really seems as manipulative or alcoholic as she does in this chapter. It's really telling how Weiss put the golden necklace on the stag to claim it as the animal she had captured, and Willow puts her gold necklace onto Weiss. The parallels are overwhelming. One big gripe, do you see this? Do you see what that says? Midnight. Now, I could be wrong, but I could have swore midnight was supposed to be, dark. Next up is The Garden, another RWBY chapter. This one is kinda weird. At least it's not bogged down with a heavy-handed exposition like RWBY's other chapters, but it just has RWBY running around a hedge maze, expressing how she misses the rest of her team. It's not bad, but it's also nothing special. They could have definitely done a lot more with this chapter. Next up is The Journey, another Yang chapter. She has a robot arm now. Yeah, we skipped over that part too. She says goodbye to the elderly neighbor from before and departs. She gets attacked by a group of bandits, and she basically vents her frustrations onto their leader. Again, this chapter isn't bad, but I wish there was more here. Yang's story has been really emotional so far, and this chapter feels really heavy-handed in comparison. Back to Blake for The Rose. This chapter is actually pretty interesting. Blake meets someone who's been hurt by her prior actions in the White Fang. This is a unique way of having Blake actually confront her past, and to help her come to terms with it. Visually, it's a little dull, but the message itself is sweet. Finally, on our last chapter, The Cage, we go back to Weiss, determined to run away from her horrid family and reunite with her friends. She decides to also release Willow's caged animals. Dead of night, what? What is with these Weiss chapters not showing us the right time of day? You have a colorist on your team. Did they not get the memo? It's easy, watch. There, nighttime, easy. Anyways, Willow catches her and confronts her. This is also when Weiss sees her family using imprisoned faunas for convict labor. Weiss is disgusted, and this is the final straw before she finally lashes out, fighting against her mother and releasing the animals, finally free from her family's icy grasp. It's a good way to end Weiss's story, if a little rushed. And while I don't think the convict labor part was necessary to convince Weiss to escape, it's not like it's hurting the narrative. We finish off the comics with various shots showing us the different stages we've seen the girls and the world, promising each other that they will come back together one day. So, that's the RWBY DC Comics. I remember when it first came out, everyone was making fun of it, specifically the artwork. Long neck Nora was something I saw everywhere. And I'll be honest, I came in ready to tear it apart, and find all the dumb, goofy art mistakes I could. I did not expect it to be as beautiful as it actually is. Some chapters aren't really my style, and there is some weirdness here and there. I get the feeling the artists never really knew how to draw any of our male characters, which was unfortunate, but some of these panels are just stunning. On top of that, the various covers that come along with the books are all beautiful as well. Any one of them could be a poster, and I'd buy it. More importantly, however, I didn't expect to enjoy the story as much as I did either. While not every chapter is amazing, some of them really blew me away. Every single Weiss chapter was especially fantastic. Most of Yang's and Blake's chapters were fun. RWBY really gets shafted in this regard. Her chapters got stuck on exposition a lot of the time, and it's a shame. Some things here and there aren't exactly accurate to the show either. Like, it's implied Weiss's sister isn't in the military in the comic. And that actually plays a really big role for Weiss's character in the show, so that's weird. These inconsistencies and the fact we breeze over or skip most of the backstory explaining the world and characters from the first 3 seasons is why I'm pretty sure this wouldn't be very good for someone who's trying to use these comics as a shortcut to get into the world of RWBY. On the other hand, though, we spent a lot of time bogging down several chapters covering elements that the fans of the show would already know about, wasting time on whole chapters to go over the fall of Beacon, or the Grimm, or other aspects we don't need explained to us. So who exactly are these comics for? Well, I'll tell you. Everyone who didn't like Season 4. Specific, I know. When Season 4 aired, it was marred with a handful of production woes. It's not terrible, but compared to the show's progress from Seasons 1 through 3, Season 4 is definitely a step backwards when it comes to character progression. It was the first time the writers tried something so different. The show went from fun antics to something much more serious. Also beforehand, every couple of episodes would be a complete little adventure. Starting with Season 4, it started becoming a long-running narrative, with our attention split between 4 different characters. Needless to say, there was a lot of potential that got left on the cutting room floor. These DC comics really help pick up the pieces from Volume 4's mistakes. Blake's past with the White Fang and her regret over what happened to her friends? Well, it's touched on in the show, but Blake only ever talks to her dad about it, not her mother. Yang dealing with her missing arm? We skip over that, to show her getting along just fine with her new robotic one. Weiss's struggles with Willow? We don't even see Willow in the show until the 7th season. Weiss instead deals with her father's abuse. These are all aspects I would have loved to actually get to see addressed in the show proper, but getting to see them find life here in the comics is great in its own right. The only thing the show did better was RWBY's side of the story, which gave us a fleshed out adventure with RWBY and her friends. If you like the show, I bet you'll like the comics. And if you like the comics, I bet you'll like the show. If you don't like either, but you stuck around to this point of my review, well, thanks for at least checking out my video. Either way, I hope you all had fun with this. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Shout out to my $10 patrons. You're all amazing. Nako, Michael, James Dodds, Cool Duck, Andrew, Ramiel, Valhalla Knight, Chamomile, G Extreme, Classy Critic, Surge, Dakota D, Taj, Boulder Off Bros, Noah Perkins, Sunny Shy, and Mookie. So yeah, have any of you read the comics? I know a lot of people were sitting there making fun of like Long Neck Nora when it first came out, and I was surprised how good it is. So have any of you actually sat down and read it? What about those new Justice League comics? Does that look cool to any of you? Did my review change your mind? Do you think you might check out the comics now? Any and all thoughts and opinions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.